Welcome to episode number 3 of Believers and Nonbelievers in Discussion. Today we are going to be discussing the origin of life. So, big topic. John is going to be moderating today, so I'm going to turn it over to him in 1 second. What I want to add at the beginning of this is that we have an additional event that we're launching in a couple of weeks. After the first event, Kelly had brought up to me that he thought some of the points that were made were incomplete or incorrect or various.
We could discuss it further, yeah.
Yeah, we thought we had more to say. So he wanted to get together and have a little post-mortem. So, we started with just thinking about him and I sitting down and do it, and then he thought, well, why don't we just do it publicly the same way? So we're going to be doing it that way. I'm calling it Afterwards, W-O-R-D-S, if you're going to Google it. And these events will be on the same Facebook page as the Believers and Nonbelievers. It'll be on the same meetup pages that you know. So look for those, and we'll start them in a couple weeks. We'll do one probably every 2 episodes. So the first one upcoming on January 22nd, 2017 is going to cover episode 1 and 2 of this. So we'll do probably about an hour of each episode. And there'll be audience involvement in that also. Okay, John, take it away.
Well, welcome everybody. Glad to see everyone's here. We will get started in just a second. Or we're going to start right now, but the topic for today is the origin of life. And we have 4 panelists, 2 versus 2. And we're going to go ahead and just give a quick little introduction of everybody. You will tell your sides. We'll go back and forth. We'll kind of slingshot, and I'll just flip a coin mentally in my head. And we will go back and forth, give us a brief introduction, 5 minutes each person. Yeah, 2 to 5 minutes, but please don't interrupt. No one interrupt anybody. This is their time, your time, their time, your time. And I will start. Might as well go down this way. Kelly?
I get to start.
Oh, actually, I'm just going to go briefly introduce everybody,
okay,
and
sure.
I'll have you start. Kelly Clemson from Areopagus.
Pronounce, yes. Areopagus Project.
There we go.
That's right.
Project.
It's Greek,
Project.
so
yes.
It could be Greek.
Michael Corcoran. Corcoran. There we go. Phil Calderon and Brian Scott. Please start.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Kelly. I'm sorry, I forgot your name now already. John. Like John said. Needless to say, I come from the God side. Hi to many of you out there. Eric, how's it going? Keith, my friend. Sorry I don't know everybody, but those are a couple. A couple things that I wanted to read off. That's why I brought all these huge signs here, because I don't see that well. Just some statements from different people. You can read along with me. This particular one is from a gentleman by the name of Richard Lewontin. And just follow along if you can. He says about the topic of God, for want of a better term, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of tolerance for the scientific community of unsubstantiated just-so stories. Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a natural explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced to, by our prior adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. Where was I at? Concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the undefined, to the uninitiated, Moreover, the materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. I would sum that up by this. If you were going to go out into local mountains and you were in search of someone that had gotten lost, and let's assume that I'll pick Running Springs, for example. In your childhood, you were mistreated badly by somebody in Running Springs. You hate Running Springs. You don't ever want to go there again. So when you come to the search, you're in charge of the search for this person that's lost. If you exclude running springs, and the person's that's in running springs is the one you're looking for, you're not ever going to find him. You have a priori adherence to not looking in running springs. And like I said, if the person that you're looking for is in running springs, you're not ever going to find him. I have one other thing that's fun, since this gets so serious sometimes. I have this quote, and there's $20 to whoever gets this first. Raise your hand with the answer. So what he says is, as a child, I reviewed instruction both in the Bible and the Talmud. I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene.
Einstein.
Uh-oh, you got it already.
$20.
It is $20, so I'm fully planning on paying it. Did you guys all get the full reading? Because I wanted to get that part out.
Go ahead, yeah, do the reading, please.
No one can read the Gospels without feeling an actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates in every word. No myth is filled with such life. Jesus is too colossal for the pen of a phrasemonger, however artful. No man can dispose of Christianity with the bon mot. I didn't know what that meant, so I had to look it up. A clever remark. So that's Einstein's philosophy on it. But since I did promise the $20, I knew somebody would get it, so I happened to bring 20 with me.
This is an honest guy here.
Well. So anyway, that's, I've got a couple other things to go over, but that's enough for now. I don't want to bore you guys completely right off the bat.
Okay. And this is one of the few times where I really wish I wasn't moderating. Could have had $20. No. But we're going to go ahead and start with you, Brian.
Oh, okay.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Brian. I'm an astrophysics PhD student. My main research interests are in galaxy formation and cosmology. But I'm actually here this afternoon not really to talk about sort of the religious or theological implications to this topic. Those are topics for philosophers or theologians. I'm a scientist and I'm here to talk about the science. And although there may be important implications to the questions we're going to talk about, what I want to focus my time on is addressing common misconceptions and the sort of key common misconception. Yeah. So the sort of key common misconception that people have is that the origin of life is some sort of intractable problem. Although it is true that we do not have a complete theory which describes how life emerges from chemistry, there are many facts for which the literature and scientists, there's a broad consensus about those facts. And I want to sort of address something that actually Kelly just said, which is that these facts are not the product of scientists intent on finding a specific answer, and indeed I'd argue that it could not be the case. These facts come from many separate fields of study and are focused on very specific problems that don't have this sort of clear overarching narrative to them. It's only when we start to build theories, which are collections of facts and models, that we recognize that they tell a coherent story about the origin of life. For example, we now understand that the membrane-like structure of the cell is extremely common in nature, that amino acids form under conditions relevant to the origin of life on Earth, and that indeed functional proteins commonly form under these same conditions. Our problem is often that we actually know too much about the origin of life. We don't have easy ways to distinguish between the different scenarios. So we know the which, but we don't know precisely where. It's sort of the way people in the field often describe it. So in the simplest terms, life on Earth arose through a combination of organic molecules that were in fluctuating environments. Very soon after, these were wrapped in a membrane. And once they're wrapped in a membrane, you have something that an objective observer will characterize as being life. That doesn't mean that there aren't still many important questions, but the key again is that this picture is supported by many independent lines of evidence. And many of those lines of evidence are probably far too technical to talk about today. But I do want to end by noting that this is a great example of good science. The ultimate arbiter of scientific truth is experiment. Arguments over the origin of life that lack experimental evidence may be interesting, they may be worth talking about, they may be worth talking about for philosophers and theologians, but our progress in this field, as in science in general, is based on what has now been many decades of successful experiments that enrich our understanding of life itself and make fruitful predictions in many fields. And that's sort of the main takeaway that I want to leave you guys with.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Corcoran. I am a Roman Catholic. I've taught Sunday school in the past. I have a history undergraduate degree, and I'm a paralegal. And I'm just here to try to, as best I can, represent sort of what the views of the Catholic Church would be. I have no actually particular weighing in against, say, like Big Bang cosmology or the origin of life or macroevolution. It was a Catholic priest, George Lemaitre, if I pronounced that French name correctly, I hope, who first proposed, I believe, the theory for Big Bang cosmology. So I'm someone who doesn't really probably see too much conflict between faith and reason or science and religion. And I'm just going to try to, I'm not here in an official capacity, but I'm just going to try as best as I can to represent what the Catholic Church would say about X or Y. And that's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to start by saying that on this topic in particular, there's an elephant in the room that we need to recognize. We're not going to talk about it today. I actually we'll have another session on it down the road, but it needs to be mentioned because there is a context on the broader subject. It's the wedge document put out by the Discovery Institute a few years ago, and the wedge strategy. I'm going to leave it there, except to say that it needs to be looked at and considered in context of this discussion. So enough of that for now. I've been looking at the arguments for intelligent design, since I know Brian's strongly has the science side, so it gave me the opportunity to go look at the intelligent design argument. What I like to do is take the strongest challenge and face it head on. So I've been reading Stephen Meyer's material and actually William Dembski's material also. I read both Dembski's first book and then Signature in the Cell from Stephen Myers, who's the major proponent who you see out there doing debates and publicity and media and stuff. So I've kind of tried to learn his arguments and to see if they made sense, because I usually have a problem with religious explanations. Meyer is different, I will say. He's a very intelligent guy, very smart guy. However, there are still problems. And I am concerned because he is a very intelligent guy and he's very articulate and good, and frankly I think he's quite honest too in what he believes, that he is persuasive in his arguments, and I think his arguments are incorrect. At this point I'm just going to start with one argument, is that this also comes from Fred Hoyle, who Kelly will tell you who Hoyle was. Mention it briefly, because I don't even. He was an astronomer.
He was a steady stater. He was an astronomer, and he was a steady stater like Einstein was before.
Was it mathematician or?
He was a British mathematican. Yeah, he's knighted, whatever that.
Okay, so we'll just leave it at there for now. Yeah. So British mathematician. So again, a very strong guy, and his proposal was that if you want to look at the point where non-life converted to life. And we're trying to figure out, did this really happen without an intelligent designer? That the odds of it happening are ridiculously low. And the number that he came up with, the chance of making the number of required enzymes for the simplest living cell is 10 to 40,000. Now, obviously, this is a big, huge number, especially when you compare it to the number of atoms in the universe, which is approximately 10 to the 80. So we're in a realm where it basically couldn't happen. I mean, you can have those philosophical arguments about could it really happen once kind of a thing. I'm going to kind of believe. I'm going to go along with Hoyle and that broad concept that it can't happen in that sense. And you see just from that alone how it seems very believable that it could not happen naturally. the problem is, and it's interesting to see that there are a lot of people over the last 100 years who have made this argument and have followed along, both from a science side and from a philosophy side and a theological side. But they are missing a major point, which is that the origin of life does not start with a single cell. It's not like we have to get from zero, a pile of, okay, 1 minute. It's not that we have to get from a pile of elements to a single cell, because obviously that's just like the argument about putting together an airplane with a whirlwind. It's not going to happen. Let's just concede that. It's a very small, slow growth of tiny steps. We don't have to have numbers of 10 to the whatever. All we have to do is have a nucleotide that is, or a chemical that's 2 nucleotides long becoming a chemical that is 3 nucleotides long, which is obviously a simple thing. It's relevant and it's doable. And then we have to investigate the reasons why the bigger molecule would then be viable enough to stay around. So the big numbers that you see, I see why that people have been hooking onto that. That's really just not what the argument is, though. And that's enough to get started.
Okay, so we've had some pretty good introductions. Does anybody want to continue off of, and I'm going to offer to you guys first because oh, and actually, I'm sorry, before we continue any further, I didn't disclose, I am an atheist, I am moderating, but I will be as fair and objective as I possibly can. So since you guys had the last word, one of you guys want to jump off of that point in terms of the numbers, or did you have somewhere where you wanted to go?
Sure. I'm sorry. Bad on names.
Brian.
Okay, Brian, I wanted to address something. You had talked about amino acids forming. A couple of problems with that. Amino acids aren't life.
No,
all they are is just a chemical molecule, right. A chemical. So I'm sure you know that the left-handed, right-handed aspect to it. I've read a little about it, and I understand the meteor thing.
Would you mind being a little more specific
Yeah.
for people who don't know that?
Life is made up, in the protein side, of strictly left-handed amino acids. In the random process that I think has been introduced, energy can create matter. But when it does, amino acids can be formed, and they are formed in asteroids, at least that's the assumption. Amino acids can be formed. Urich and Miller created them. The problem is that it forms both sides at the same time, left and right-handed. But life is only made up by left-handed. So the problem you run into is a mathematical one, that even the simplest protein is 400 amino acids long. So if you take that as an analogy, it's just as easy for the left-handed and right-handed ones to bond, and they can just as easily bond to each other. So what you run into with the problem is an analogy of flipping a coin, because there's right-handed and left-handed, and they're going to bond just as easily, which they can't bond in the presence of oxygen, by the way. But that left-handed only system, a simple evaluation of that is meant to be that way. Somebody directed it that way. Something called telonomy, and I hope you're pronouncing that right. That's the idea of something down the road that you're trying to achieve. I don't understand how randomness does that, because when you're talking about the amino acids forming into these long strands, there's several problems with it, but the first one being that as soon as you have a right-handed one in that strand, the strand's now poisonous to life. So you have to have only left-handed ones, and in this random idea that comes up in the naturalism assumption of things is that these amino acids are going to only form with these left-handed ones. Well, like I said, they bond just as easily left or right. So the analogy that you use is tossing a coin. And that coin's only going to come up heads 400 times in a row in this analogy. Now, if you're playing the game where they have the ball under one, and I'm going to give you 3 of them. The ball under one, and they mix them up, and you try to choose which one it is. If you're standing there watching this guy do this for a whole day, and in this random thing where he's trying to get you to pick the ball correctly, you never get the ball right. As you're standing there watching, nobody ever gets the ball right. Every single time, it's in a different one than what you pick. Would your assumption and your mind get you to go over to the guy and say, after he's mixed them up a little bit, turn over all three and see if the ball's there? My assumption and my analogy, maybe I'm not following very well, but my assumption and analogy is there's something behind it. If you've only got left-handed ones aligning, and there's just as big a chance that right-handed ones are going to be in it too, flipping the coin 400 times in a row and coming up heads every single time, wouldn't you want to inspect the coin?
And
See
Kelly,
if it's got both heads on
Kelly,
both sides?
is that what you were directing towards Brian?
Yes.
What you were
So
pointing
I
to?
was making a statement there instead of
Okay.
asking a question.
So,
So Brian,
Brian-
how would that be resolved? The only left-handed ones.
So I think at a very low level, you're being misled by your analogies.
Yeah,
sorry.
I can hear you.
Yes, please.
So at a very low level, what's happening, I think, is that there's the analogies that are being used are misleading. In our everyday lives, we use the word random to mean a lot of things. In sciences, we often talk about stochastic processes. Stochastic processes is intuitively similar to random processes, but stochastic processes are used in many fields to produce deterministic conclusions. There's a type of simulation, a type of process called the Monte Carlo method that uses this, and this is a standard part of physics, it's a standard part of risk assessment, people in many different industries. It's not some obscure thing, right? The notion that something random can't produce some particular answer is just simply not the case. I think the other thing that is a little bit misleading is the notion that you need 400 amino acids of chains that are very long to get something that's meaningful. In fact, in experiments, we find that there are functional proteins formed from very short amino acid chains. So I think that's another problem. I don't know if maybe you know more about the left-hand versus right-handed issue. I will say, just give me just a second. So where I also wanted to go with that is to mention that proteins are not necessarily expected to be around at the origin of life. Proteins may be a much later adaptation. There is some debate in the field over this. There's something called RNA world, where essentially RNA in a lipid membrane is the first sort of protocell. There is another model which has proteins come first, and that would be relevant there. But the consensus in the field is that proteins are sort of a later adaptation. RNA is able to take over the functions of life very early on.
Just to give a quick on the left-right thing, I will agree with the concept that you throw a coin 400 times in a row, you're just not going to get your 400 heads. This is the same concept that I just said about the big numbers. So I'll even give you that on the 40 coins. So obviously and what he's talking about is when amino acids can form in enantiomers, they're called, which are mirror image of the molecule. So a left-handed one has this shape and the right-handed one has this shape, so they fold in different ways. And life only uses the left-handed ones. But chemically, if you just put a chemical mix together, you get a 50-50 mix of both. So that tells me that obviously something else is involved here. There's another variable that we're not accounting for. So you get into your two options without putting a dichotomy too hardly into it, is that there's either something we don't know, or you've got an external intelligent, I don't want to go to deity because we're not really going to that. So there's an intelligent force. So it just seems more probable. We have a disagreement about which direction that would seem more probable. I think on the scientific side, I don't know, to my knowledge, I'm not an expert, that we know an answer to that question yet. That's all I can say.
I did have a response, Brian, on the RNA side, RNA only. You run into the same problem. It's the opposite, but you run into the same problem. You're now lining up only right-handed amino acids. So the formation problem still comes along the same. Now, as far as life goes, proteins are required for life. There isn't any life that doesn't have that protein base.
That's actually just not true.
I think you should look that up. And
No. In the literature, in the scientific literature, and I can provide citations, as many as you want, on this topic.
Please do.
RNA, so the reason proteins are of interest is that they catalyze chemical reactions that are of interest biologically. RNA is able to do this itself, and the way cells are structured is actually thought to be an artifact of the fact that RNA was the original molecule that facilitated the chemistry of life. Proteins are a better way of doing it, and so it would be evolutionarily advantageous for proteins to come along at a later stage. So that's the answer that's in the literature. That's the scientific consensus.
I would urge everybody to check that, because I don't think that's right. Actually, I'm sure it's not.
And again, I can provide as many citations as people would like if they want to read up more.
And that's what that's what the afterwards discussions are for, definitely, to be able to go further in depth into the individual specific topics, individual specific areas of these topics. But let's go ahead and shift gears a little bit off of the amino acids. Kind of seems like we're just getting a little back and forth on that. And please give us what the Catholic view in terms of the origin of life and how it pertains with the opposing side.
Well, certainly. Well, the Catholic view would certainly believe in a creator. We do believe in a God as initiating the act of creation. Anything more specific than that would not really be anything that the Catholic Church doctrinally would have an issue with. So actually wouldn't have anything to weigh in on say, the amino acid argument or on anything else there. While you might meet someone who is a Roman Catholic who could pick a bone of contention with any of these arguments, that isn't actually in the doctrine of our faith. We don't really make pronouncements on what scientific theories are correct or not, and so someone like me would not really see any conflict between the existence of a God initiating creation and how life forms in any way that's been discussed so far.
Okay.
I think
So
that's the best way to put it.
if science gets to the point where it has a valid, like say, well experimentally, I don't want to say confirmed because that's a little too far. We know probabilities and we're real early in this field. An idea that seems to be true, that involves natural forces, it doesn't involve a deity. Historically, the Catholic Church has really suppressed those types of things, and you go back to Galileo and all sorts of other ways. So
There's some fascinating history there too.
Yeah. So how do you think they would react these days? If because I mean, to say that you can create life without a deity is a challenge, obviously, to your faith.
Well, I mean, as far as like mostly the act of creation, we're talking about like the the first cause, right? So we'd be talking about nihilo ex nihilo, from nothing comes nothing.
Well, that's we're gonna do.
But
We're gonna do the origin of the universe another day. So.
Yeah, I guess that's not quite it.
Yes, let's stick specifically to life, because
my bad.
Much broader topic.
I don't really know about too much of a conflict. Specifically, I mean, maybe they'd have moral problems if we figured out a way to, I don't know, artificially synthesize life. Maybe we'd have some kind of, I'm sure we'd have a lot of moral dilemmas there, but as far as it contradicting the faith itself, I don't think it would. But the history is something that I have a lot stronger bearing on. And I can tell you that a lot of the conflicts in the past are much more complex than simple, religion says one thing, a scientist says another, and they fight. Galileo is an excellent example, and you can tell me to stop if I start rambling about history. But like for his example, there's a lot of personal conflict that goes into the conflict with Galileo between the individual players at the time. As well as broader movements philosophically, such as Renaissance humanism, that actually have a lot to do with the conflict.
It actually made everything very complex in that, and actually that should be a jumping point for in terms of the complexity of life. That is a strong point from the ID proponents. I mean, I'm not saying that you are, but you know what I understand. Is that the complexity of life is so vast and so difficult that it couldn't have been anything but an intelligent designer, and even beyond the amino acids and all of that, just the actual complexity of it begs the question. So what are his response, either one of you? So that way we can kind of bounce back and forth here.
Well, I'll just comment on it. I don't. It's not necessarily just the idea of complexity, but it's and that's basically it. But the specified complexity is what the movement's about. Design, specified complexity. Can you come up with a possibility of 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power? I guess, but I would say what's more probable.
Well, let's say you can't. Let's just give you that one.
That's a vastly small number, as you explained, and you did a great job of explaining that. I couldn't do any better myself. So what's the opposite number? What's the opposite side of the idea? The opposite side of the idea is that somebody directed. And if you're an atheist right now, just put the God that you may have learned about in Sunday school or whatever, this disproportionate idea that you have about God, just put that out for a second and just go to design. I'm a Christian and I believe in the God of the Bible. But for a moment, take that idea that may cause dismay to you and just put it out of the way for a second. All we're talking about is what's more probable. The idea of a director that put all the left-handed amino acids in line, so it made life, and then on the RNA DNA side, put all right-handed ones in line. And isn't that more probable that somebody did that so that 'cause down the line it needed to be, as opposed to this random causation? Like what Lewontin said, those ideas are counterintuitive, and they only come into play when you refuse to allow the divine foot to get into the door. And I've got other quotes. I've got the gentleman, and unfortunately, it happened today, but I had a notebook with all these names in it. But the gentleman that first came up with the mathematical equations for string theory, he's a believer in God. And he believes in God because of the order of the universe. The anthropic principle dictates that there's 900 different settings, actually over 900 different settings, that are precisely set so that we can be here. And his assumption is with that kind of order and that kind of designation for those settings, that he believes there's a God. Now, is it a Christian God? I don't know. I haven't read enough about him yet. But he believes that the best explanation is he is a God. And he's a physicist, and he says the majority of physicists believe in God.
I would now definitely want to turn that over to our astrophysicist.
Do you know his name? Because I forgot his name.
That's
He's the guy that came up with the equations for string theory.
So there isn't one string theory. So there isn't one person who's come up with it. String theory is a branch of physics, what they call physics beyond the standard model. It's an active area of research. It may be the right answer or it may not be. But there are many different models that are contained in that generic term for string theory.
He came up with the equations for it.
Right. There aren't a single set of equations.
Well, again, I dispute that.
Well,
again, that would have to be for afterwards.
Yeah, so
he says that the equations for string theory are his.
Yeah.
That's his statement, not mine.
Right, and people are welcome to take credit for whatever they want. The fact of the matter is that it's an active area of research. So there are many different string theories. There are many different other alternative models. And you can talk to any theoretical physicist you want to, and they'll confirm that it's an active area of research, that there isn't one model that people have settled on. So the bigger problem with what you were just referring to is, well, I don't want to say this is the bigger problem, this is one problem, is that these claims are very nebulous. We don't know exactly why the laws of physics are what they are, but this is ultimately what this claim boils down to. We know why a lot of things that were previously thought to be sort of special about the universe are really not that special and are really general features of the universe that we observe that come from very general initial conditions. A general feature of physical laws and a general feature of physical theories is that they take initial conditions and they map them to some sort of prediction that you make. And so when you find that general initial conditions lead to something very specific, that's important for your physics, but it doesn't tell you any more than your physics is good at making predictions. So I don't know if you have other things you want to say.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about complexity and specified complexity. You know, when is something complex? I mean, you can kind of think of it in three levels. There's like a rock, there's a crystal and then there's something that's alive. You know, a rock is sort of a random mixture of stuff, right? A crystal has a formation to it, which is structured, but there's no meaning to it. It's not the right word, but and then something that's living is basically a functional thing. I over and over I have a problem with this word specified, the phrase specified complexity, and you see this all over the place. It just to me it sort of begs the question because it's the wrong phrase, and you know, specified means there's a specifier. So
well, that's what they're getting at.
That's actually incorrect because the concept came from mathematics, and this is what the ID proponents say, that they did not come from creationism. In fact, we'll go back to the Wedge document and discuss that later, but the proper phrase here is specific complexity or functional complexity. We can talk about something being functional, but I find it very misleading that the ID field uses the phrase specified, and this is the only phrase that they use. And this comes all the way back from Dembski's writing, who was the person who originated it. The phrase that he used originally was functional specified complexity, and that's a redundant. All he has to say is functional complexity. Let me. Okay.
And actually,
you have
would you like to clarify?
Sure.
Did he?
Yeah, the idea behind design. By the way, as far as the design movement, there's lots of people there that are not Christian. And their aim is to dispute the idea of randomness. Are there some that are Christian? Yeah, sure. But David Berlinski, for example, is in the Discovery Institute. David Berlinski is a secularist. He's not a Christian. He evaluates the claim of randomness, and he comes to the conclusion that it just can't work.
Okay, so
he comes to the same conclusion that Hoyle did.
That's one. I would like to see someone give numbers of the number of people that are in the ID movement that are not associated with creation,
sure.
with
Stephen
Christianity.
Stephen Meyer is obviously a Christian. Absolutely, he is. There's no question. So is Dembski.
Not single numbers. I'd like to see large.
We would have to look
because we can cite.
But their main directive is not, you know, for example, everybody's concerned about teaching design and creationism in schools because they say it leads directly to God. Well, my retort to that would be, we're already teaching evolution in schools, and that leads directly to atheism. So what's the difference? I would say both of them should be excluded. But that's another subject.
And
as far as specified complexity, all they're saying is that it appears as though, from what we see, the 900 different settings, which I don't see how you can, Brian, I don't see how you can come to the idea that that could be set some sort of random way. 900 different settings, the anthropic principle, 900 different settings that say it's exactly the way they have to be for us to be here. If they're off by even 1%, we wouldn't be here.
So
that's 900 different ones that you have to account for. And
so if you
that's
actually,
why guys like Hoyle, well, I'm sorry, not Hoyle, but guys like, should have brought my book, the guy that I'm talking about.
the names don't really matter.
That doesn't matter.
They don't matter. With those,
like I said, he's a
afterwards.
prominent, and the physicists, the realm, the community of physicists, the majority of them believe in God.
so
Believe in
right.
if not God, at least a first cause.
Right.
An uncaused first cause.
So you're specifying a specific belief that many people may or may not hold. I know, for instance, that many physicists are Catholic. I know many Catholic physicists. I know many Catholic cosmologists. And many Catholic theologians would take issue with your phrasing of what they believe in, and maybe Michael can comment on that. I don't know. But I want to take this back a minute, and I want to say, again, something I mentioned before, and to address each and every one of these points is a colossal task, as you said, but it's a colossal task that has been undertaken, right? As scientists, we're interested in the truth. We're interested in understanding how the universe came to be. We're interested in features of the universe that, in fact, we can exploit to make our lives better. And in fact, I think it'd be hard to argue that science hasn't at least achieved a good portion of what it promises to give us. But the fact of the matter is that there is no coherent list of these 900 properties. No,
Anthropic principle.
no, there isn't a coherent list. In fact, in many different sources, you see a different list of these properties. Some of them are as few as 10, some of them are many larger. As an undergraduate, just as sort of a toy project, I undertook a sort of exploration of what the size of the parameter space that would be consistent with something like the existence of life for one specific list, and found that the parameter space was actually quite large. But leaving that aside, that's just an undergraduate project and no one should base their beliefs on that fact. I did it because I enjoyed doing it. I'm a scientist, I'm interested in what's true. The bigger point is that we know that many of the features of the universe do come from general initial conditions. And that's something that we know. It's not disputable. It's mainstream physics. So while a large number of physicists believe in God, and I don't know if it's a majority or a minority, and frankly, I don't care. Scientists don't care what religious beliefs other scientists hold. We go to conferences and we talk about science. We talk about specific problems. I've never seen a scientist get up and say some large, huge statement about the truth in their field, right? We talk about small problems that most people don't care about and frankly shouldn't care about. They're technical problems in the field. So that's what I have to say. Scientists are interested in technical problems.
And
Yeah, sure. I have something to add. Like, yeah, we wouldn't weigh in, like, as a Catholic, on evolution being atheistic necessarily, or anything like that. I mean, it is, to be honest, there are certain problems in the church with, if they do have a problem with evolution or something, it would be if we're using it as a reason to dismiss the existence of a God, simply using evolution just as a means to say, well, then there is no God. Then yes, to be fully honest, the church does have problems with that. But yeah, it is true that probably a majority of Catholic scientists or a majority of, I mean, good amount of even the clergy would have no issue with, say, evolution or Big Bang cosmology. We're really proud that it was a Catholic priest that was part of proposing Big Bang cosmology. So there's that, and there's good work as I understand it going on at the Vatican Observatory as well. I couldn't tell you too much about the specific research that is done, but yeah, that's all I have to add so far.
Okay, I'll take us to a different point then. One of the concepts that is been brought up in the idea, and it's in my again, was the idea of the believability about life, about non-life converting to life, and then it's an unintuitive concept because he says that everything that we experience in our lifetime has a cause and effect, and in every form of life came from a previous form of life. Let's put evolution aside because we're just talking about first cause here in terms of life. But the problem with his argument is that he's using first cause to say that because he thinks you cannot have a life that came from non-life, that it matches our experience. In fact, if you think about it, that's not correct because we're not talking about subsequent life. We are talking about the first life. So if he's, and then he uses this to justify the idea that, well, therefore only an intelligent designer, only another force that is not natural can come in and make this transition. Once you cite that, you are no longer using something that is within your experience to judge. You are proposing something that does not relate to your knowledge, to your experience. You're proposing possibly something that is outside of time and space, and possibly within the universe and invisible to you, in which case you have no knowledge and experience of it. So therefore, it just does not make it an apples and orange comparison. So the validity of that logic just does not follow.
Just to explain, as far as you were bringing up judging, and I'm not sure outside time and space. I'm not sure what you're getting at there. Explain to me.
Well, he is saying that he believes that an intelligent designer is the one who made the transition, flipped the switch, let's just say, from non-life to life. And he bases it on the idea that everything we experience tells us this is how it happens. Well, that's not true. Our experiences tell us that life comes from life. So for him to bring in another entity that is outside of our experiences does not make it an analogous comparison.
Well, not only Stephen Meyer, but Louis Pasteur is the same thing. He was
Exactly, making them both wrong.
He was examining the thought patterns of the middle centuries, which honestly, I think that's what you're trying to pull from evolution, life coming from non-life. And Louis Pasteur designed his experiments to disprove that. Because they thought since the trash gathered, and the maggots and the rest of it grew on it, not to get too gross, but maggots grew on it, therefore the rats came out, the flies came out, whatever the case may be.
Let's differentiate that. You're talking about spontaneous generation.
Right.
So explain that.
It's the same thing. Spontaneous generation is the idea that life can come from non-life, chemicals. And Louis Pasteur in the mid-1800s, about the same time as Darwin, did experiments on that because he wanted to see if the Middle Ages thought pattern was correct, and he proved it not to be correct. He proved that spontaneous generation cannot happen.
He proved that mice do not appear out of nowhere when you leave grain unsupervised.
Right,
which, we got that. Okay. But that does not, again, it is not an analogous situation to you can't have an element or a molecule of 5 nucleotides becoming an element of 6 nucleotides and then continue at a million steps until you have the first metabolic pathway.
Real quick before we go back and forth, let's make sure that we distinguish between evolution and abiogenesis or spontaneous.
Right.
But because those two don't necessarily. I know we can all agree on that.
They don't add up.
Yeah.
So, not necessarily.
I just want to make sure we don't start blurring the lines.
Sure.
Please continue.
Let me make clear where I stand as far as that goes. I'm not opposed to microevolution, changes inside the species, adaptation, I would call it, but I'm not opposed to that. It happens. You can prove it. It's obvious. On the other hand, cross-species migration, this is a discussion for later. This is from Origins of Life, which I think is a better argument, but I believe the same problem exists with this, if that's where you want to go.
Yeah, and I disagree that that's
okay,
an equivalent analogy.
Let me bring up another one of my signs. I know Eric loves my signs, so let me get up another one here. This is the one that I brought up before, but I'll bring it up because there are lots of new people in the audience. Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. All right, so that sign is directing us where to go for lunch next. Who can tell me where we're going?
I can, but not by reading that sign.
My point is this. In life, there's a communication going on between DNA and RNA, and it's very similar to what this is. If this sign was coming from the DNA molecule and telling the RNA molecule what to build, it's not, but let's assume for a second it is. The RNA molecule would have no idea what it was being instructed unless they were going from the same pattern, the same language, so to speak.
There you go, Kelly.
This is my example of exactly what we're talking about here. This has nothing to do with the directions to our restaurant, but none of you could have told that because I'm the only one that has the code. My point is this, me being the only one that has the code, there's no way to describe it. There's no way for you to tell what this is. If in fact, these things all come from randomness and the DNA and the RNA molecule are supposed to communicate, I would need to know how that happened, how they communicated. How do they communicate on that level to be able to have the DNA and the RNA speak the same language? Because that has to be preset, just like what this is. If I gave you guys the code to this, then you could read it. But if you don't know the code, you're not going to read it. And my point is this, when the DNA is telling the RNA what to do, they have to speak the same code. And if there's a code that was set up beforehand, and you tell me how a random process creates a code, I don't think you can tell me that. But there's a barrier there between them communicating. The same barrier that you have trouble communicating with this. So please tell me how that communication happens in a random framework, naturalistic framework.
Other one?
Do you want to comment? So again, I think you're being misled by your analogies.
Tell me how.
Yeah, I will. Getting to it.
I'm open.
No, you're being
Hoping to
misled.
hear.
So DNA and RNA, we talk about them as if they're a code, but that's an analogy. What's really going on is that they're speaking the language of physics. Physics dictates how bonds in atoms and molecules, or I shouldn't say bonds in atoms, bonds in molecules are broken, put back together. There's no meaning, they're not symbols. So something like this is compelling because we speak a language. We look at sequences of marks on a paper and we can draw meaning out of that because we give it meaning. We agreed on meaning. But there isn't meaning inherent in that. It's a pre-agreement among us. And in the same way, there's no meaning in DNA. It's just chemistry, it's just physics. There's no problem here.
I would say that there's no meaning, but there is function.
Right. I mean, there's
And
function in the sense that physics works in a certain way, that chemistry works in a certain way.
And also function in the sense that let's back it down to chemical evolution. You know, prebiotic, pre-proto-life. Let's call it. There would be presumably a function that would cause one molecule to exist and stay in existence and not get broken down as much as the next guy, for some presumably chemical or physics reason, solubility, catalyzing other things, whatever. Otherwise it would just get eaten up by other chemicals competitively, like you were talking about.
And I think it's important again to specify that when we're talking about this kind of thing, we're talking about things that you see in the laboratory. It's not some sort of some idea that's just floating out there. It's something that you can build experiments with. You can look at how these bonds are broken. You can look at how this chemistry works. And I mean, this is what you see. It's not something that's debatable. This is something that happens in the laboratory under controlled conditions. It's something that happens in nature and that we've observed. And there's a huge literature upon it, about it. This is a topic that people have studied for more than half a century. There's open questions, but this is not one of them. This is not something that people in the field find compelling. This is not something that you see in the literature. And the people that are responsible for generating this literature are not people with some sort of preconceived notion about what they set out to find. They come from all walks of life. They come from all religious backgrounds. They come from every philosophical view you could think of. We don't talk about whether we want to disprove God at scientific conferences. We don't care. It's irrelevant.
Okay.
Well, that's really wasn't my question. Are you trying to say that the DNA and the RNA don't communicate with the language?
No, they don't use a language.
Okay,
DNA.
well, I think everybody needs to look that up because other than you, I believe every other biologist that I've talked to says they do.
Right, and what they're
DNA
doing,
tells the RNA what to go out and build. It builds
Right.
proteins that are very specific for building the human body.
Yeah.
And the DNA is so exact. If somebody leaves DNA on a gun and we find the gun, we know who held it.
Right.
So the idea that it's not specific and accurate to a single person that's just not science. It is definitely that way.
Yeah, so
It's a specific.
I'm gonna let you respond real quickly to that, but I know you have one. You had a point you wanted to say as well. Sorry. Respond. I know you wanted to respond real quickly to the DNA language thing real quick.
Let's have him respond first.
First, and then you. Okay.
No, you go first.
Okay. So I think there were some claims there that you ascribed to me that I didn't make. But leaving that aside, what I'm saying is that when we talk about DNA and RNA as a language that they're communicating with each other, that's an analogy to human languages. That's an analogy to things that we construct. To understand what a language is, to understand what meaning is, that's a philosophical question. That's not something that that biologists are interested in. It's something that we use to think about the problem, to give us intuition for the problem. Something that's come up a lot. I don't want to distract from what Michael wants to say, but something that's come up a lot is the notion that things are unintuitive in science, and that's certainly true. But it's intuitive in a certain domain. Many things that you might find unintuitive, I don't find unintuitive because I work in a certain frame of reference, a certain set of physical laws that we understand about the world. And I have training to understand what those laws mean. I have a set of different experiences from you do. And we should talk about how our different experiences lead to truth or our perception of truth. But that is also a different question. So yeah, biologists use the metaphor of a language to describe DNA. But DNA isn't literally a language.
Okay.
Okay. And I would definitely agree with just the fact that, I mean, science and philosophy being two very separate things. that I wouldn't see. I mean, from my faith perspective, wouldn't really see a conflict. But for the purpose of the debate, I will now not believe in macroevolution. So I was just going to ask, I believe how would you explain extremely complex systems? Like, I cannot remember the number of components in, for example, like a perfectly functional eyeball, that you need a certain number of functioning components in the eye in order to work, and without some of them, or without all of them there, you don't have a useful math. So how would something like that come about spontaneously or through random mutation?
That would be more in evolution. I mean, it does have pertinence to origin of life, but kind of seems like a strain a little. But
I'll have to invite you back then, because we're going to do micro versus macro evolution in I think 2 sessions.
Okay, that's a different
down
one.
and divide evolution down into subjects, because
it's
there's
so much.
just so much.
Well, so we can get back on the topic of the origin of life.
We'll answer that question.
I'm thinking that we kind of shift gears here, because what it seemed like between the two of you is you're wanting to implement intentions into the origin of life, and you definitely don't see any intentions into the origin of life. So it kind of seems like there is a disconnect in terms of, we're talking about numbers, we're talking about this, but what exactly in the aspects of these large random numbers, how does that actually bring us toward an intentional action of creating life? And then how would you, obviously respond to that? So please. You see my point?
Sure,
how
yeah,
we're trying to get back to the intentions of a designer.
Okay, so what you're saying is like the eventual philosophical outcome towards having
these, everything that you have said so far in terms of the numbers has definitely brought us further into the discussion.
Okay.
But the intentions, I don't think we've made that connection of there's a designer and the intentions were there.
Okay.
It just kind of feels like we're talking about numbers and chance and probability without actually.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, if we're here talking about whether there was or was not a designer, let's talk about the designer for a second.
Okay. Well, I guess we can move into that. I'm happy to do so because, as I said, I'm a Christian. My idea behind it all and why it is that I have a problem with the idea of randomness is because it tells all of you that you have no purpose. All you are is just a random set of accidents. You're here because some accident happened, and if the future something accident happens, you might not be here. Besides the fact that I don't find it to be scientific to credit randomnism for that, besides that, I find it to be a detrimental viewpoint, because if in fact you tell someone that they're only here because of some random accident, then it's logical to assume they're going to conduct their life that way. On the other hand, if you tell them they were designed and you have a purpose for being here, then maybe they're going to conduct their life in a different way. Am I saying that atheists can't be moral? I'm not, because a lot of them are. But what I am saying is that the idea behind I'm only here from a random accident, I'm not going anywhere afterwards. Let me give you my story. The reason why I'm a Christian is because in 1999, Keith knows my story. In 1999, a drunk driver made a left turn in front of me, and my 5-year-old daughter was with me, and she didn't survive the accident. And what I would ask for the atheist is, please give me some hope that something's going to happen afterwards. What hope are you going to give me? Are you going to tell me that my daughter's now gone, she's turning into dust, and that's the end of it all? That doesn't give me very much hope. On the other hand, and I think we have proved up here with at least a 50-50 chance that God is there. On the other hand, you can come to the conclusion that you are designed, there is a reason for you being here, and there was a reason for her being here as well.
So
she came into this world so that I would turn my ideas towards being drunk and all the rest of the ways I used to go, which I won't go into all of them, but they were bad. and turn my attention onto the afterlife, onto eternity.
Can I answer this?
Let me just get done. Turn my life instead towards the eternal, and that there is a designer, there is somebody who's in charge of things, there aren't any accidents. That incident that happened turned me around. I no longer live my life the way I used to live it. I live it for a purpose now. I live it for the purpose of serving God.
Okay, and we're gonna go ahead and turn that on over.
Okay.
Obviously, it's a sad thing.
But my point is, and thank you for bearing with me because I barely made it through it. But my point is, what answer do you have for me?
Let me broaden this for not just you, but for humanity.
Okay.
If you would. You know, I've been reading books on big history, which include beginning of time to current, and you get a lot of context when you start to read some of that stuff. You know, and what we've learned in science is science tells us nothing about purpose, other than there seems to be no purpose and meaning. So, and we also know that humans, as sentient beings, put purpose into things sort of by intuition. They want there to be that. It's one of those things in evolution that has kept us alive. If you assume purpose, you notice things that might have killed you before, and if you're wrong, no harm done. So we do tend to see purpose where purpose isn't. I see this as a I'm not sure if this is just the right word, but it's sort of a maturation of the species as we go forward, and I'm talking big history, so thousands of years here, of just coming to grips with what we are learning. We are going through a phase that may have started, say, around the Enlightenment, of realizing that there are no supernatural entities, and it's a tough thing to come to grips with. You know, you talk to anybody who's gone from Christianity to non-belief, and they will tell you how hard it is to give up the fear of hell, how hard it is to give up lack of purpose, because that's very important in their lives. And yet, that's what reality seems to be teaching us. And, you know, we can have this discussion in 200 years, and it'll be a little bit more clearer. So I don't have an answer to satisfy you, Kelly, but I think there is value in our species to learn how to come to grips with this, and because I truly believe that we do the best as people when we work with what is true, not what we want to be true. We definitely want purpose. We definitely want life after death. We are learning that those things aren't there. So I think it's hard to do, but this whole process is how we slowly come to grips with this stuff.
Can I respond?
Yes.
So, you made a lot of statements there that you assumed were true. No supernatural being just because of the Enlightenment. There's lots of people in the Enlightenment period that still believe in God, and actually most of them didn't.
Granted, it's a sort of an opinion statement. So,
but it wasn't opinion, Phil. You said there's no supernatural being, and that's an assumption.
Well, the arc of evidence seems to be teaching us this.
I disagree, because the naturalism that we've been talking about, and okay, let me connect this a little bit. Okay, when I first came to faith, I read the Bible the first time. I wasn't taken to Sunday school as a kid. You might think I was. I wasn't. I was raised in, I guess you best describe it as an agnostic home. We didn't go to church. We didn't do any of those things. I might have believed there might have been a God, but if you talk to me about Jesus, I crossed you off of anybody I ever wanted to talk to again, because that's nut bar stuff. But that all changed. And you might think it all changed because of an emotional experience, which that turned me that way. But when I turned that way, I didn't go that way because, as you guys would describe it, as faith. Okay, and actually I thought Eric's definition of faith was very good, trust. It's what you trust in. So when I came to that conclusion, when I started reading the Bible the first time, it was great. Based on my position, I would love for it to be true. But when I read it, I put it down for a second and I said, well, this would be nice if any of it's true.
And actually, that's a very good point in terms of, you guys were talking about this earlier.
Because there's been lots of atheists come to faith.
Well, whether the statement is true, whether it provides hope, and actually this is going to definitely be all the way across the board here, whether it provides hope for you, does that, if you want it to be, does that actually make it true? Because
no, and that's my point. I mean, and that's a good question, because just because I want it to be true, and I might want to be able to fly, but if I jump off of a cliff, I'll find out really quick that idea is not true. But when my journey is different from others, and I actually,
in fact,
I envy others because they didn't have to go through what I went through. But based on me going to college, them teaching me about the evolutionary theory, I had to know it wasn't true. That's the reason why I'm where I'm at, and that's the reason why I don't believe any of it. Because I've researched it, and I've went through it, I've studied it, and I asked God, I said, show me. I'm not, show me, I'm showing.
Okay.
Just show me that it's true. Because I want to believe, but I need to know that it's true. I'm not going to live my life on some fairy tale like what you would see. Forgive me if any of you are Mormon. But some fairy tale like what Mormonism describes in their book.
Okay, I think we strayed a little bit from that. I think we strayed a little bit into Mormonism.
But let me just finish.
Okay, please finish.
I'll wrap it up. So what I wanted to know, first of all, is it historic? Are the documents that are listed in the Bible historic?
Wait, I'm sorry.
Can they be proved?
Oh.
And is this real? And that's what my journey was. Is this real? I need to know it's real.
I'm sorry. That sounds like we're talking about the Bible and we're preaching about the Bible right now. I thought we were talking about the origin of life. I'm sorry.
And that's part of it.
So please.
That's part of it. And the fact that what I'm getting at is that, in fact, the description that you see in Genesis is a realistic description.
That's actually a perfect point to jump off.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the description in Genesis actually being accurate to science?
Oh, well, first I just want to say too, I would completely agree with a lot of what Kelly said about coming to God, finding God, and about the existence certainly of an afterlife. And I wouldn't really find a conflict with naturalism, with evolution as an explanation. I really don't find a conflict between those two things. That's the only other thing I was going to add. But now you've said about Genesis, how I feel about Genesis.
Yes,
There's a bone of contention within Christianity. I would believe generally in something, the term that's a mouthful, the historical critical method of biblical exegesis, which hopefully I said the last one right because it is Greek.
You did.
Yes, there we go. So I would view, for example, the book of Genesis as a very important book from God, not necessarily literal, and in the mainstream thought of the church in history, specific literalism in regards to Genesis wasn't really in vogue. It was in like the 200s AD, and then after that, not as often. But I would find that I wouldn't use Genesis as a document to describe like the literal way that God made man, but I would still find it as a book that has meaning that involves a lot of history and culture of the time, which is like a whole long bit that I would take everyone's time with, and so I will let you move to
most definitely.
else.
What are your thoughts?
I don't have very much to add. As I said when I started, I'm not a philosopher and I'm not a theologian. I'm here to talk about science. So,
okay. And in terms of the science aspect of it, it seems like we had heard a lot of stories, and I don't mean stories divisively. You know what I mean. But we've heard a lot of different stories. What is your take on in terms of the truth value of these claims?
Of Genesis?
Of Genesis and those things in terms of...
I'm not, like I said, not a historian. I don't have any expertise in this field. But my cursory understanding of what the scholarly consensus is that these books are meant to provide context to the lives of religious people, in particular in the time and place that they were written. And that's as far as I think I'm willing to comment.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that topic for another day.
There we go.
Because it's important stuff to talk about.
Yes.
I'm going to take us back to origins because there's another point that is made within the intelligent design movement that I have a problem with, and that's the concept of information. I'm not entirely sure if it started from information theory in mathematics. I think it did, but I'd have to research back a little bit. But that's the way it's presented from Dembski and to people going forward. Oddly, I find it sort of an odd sort of fetish, honestly, that the whole information is like, of course there's information. You know, of course things have, you know, if anything is definable, why is it this shape and that shape? There's information involved.
We have the right of agreement.
And we know the difference between information in life and information in a Starbucks cup. So, you know, it's more complex. I do want to dispel one big point, though, and I hear this all the time, and it drives me nuts because it's just not true. The idea that you cannot get information, additional information from generation to generation without a designer or a supernatural intervener. You know, we've got, it's not true. I almost have a hard time understanding why people think this. When you can have a mutation in a piece of DNA, and you can add, you can subtract, you end up with a more functional, a less functional. You have some variants that are non-functional. You have some variants that are fatal, for sure. Those don't go into the next generation. They die in utero, they die in infanthood, whatever. But it seems fairly obvious that you don't need a designer to have new information. People say that, you know, where does a new gene come from, as if it takes, you've got to go, like randomness means going from one generation to the other, from like a non-leg to a leg kind of a thing. Isn't it fairly simple to think that, to realize that you get a point mutation? I mean, there's other types of mutation, but that's too much detail. Just by nature?
Okay, well, let me reference a few things on that. They did a fruit fly experiment. I'm sure you guys both heard about it, right? Fruit flies have a very short lifespan, and they're radiating them. They're trying to prove through radiation that some new functionality would come into the fruit fly. And they used a fruit fly because it has a really short lifespan. Therefore, they can have many millions of generations in a relatively short time that they could actually study. So they did this. They radiated fruit flies over, I don't know what the time frame was, but it was plenty of generations. And the idea behind it is that this mutation is going to produce some sort of a new function, like you said. Mutation can generate some sort of a new aspect or a new functionality to a particular organism. So if they took the fruit fly, they radiated the fruit fly for however long it was. I think it was over a 20-year span. The fruit fly definitely did produce some odd characteristics, but not one time did it produce anything that wasn't already in the fruit fly. It had wings growing out of the eyes, it had legs growing out of the head, but it never produced anything that wasn't already in the fruit fly. My point is this, that, and this is down the road from Origin of Life, but since you brought it up, let's talk about it.
It occurred to me as I was asking it. That's a little bit.
That's okay. That's
sorry
right.
about that.
So the point is this: if in fact this evolutionary process should happen from this random mutation going on, then during the million generations of this fruit fly, it should have produced something other than what the fruit fly already had. But it didn't. The only thing that happened was the fruit fly got less functional, for the most part, but it had already existing stuff that was in the DNA was reproduced, but it never produced anything new. And if you're going to have this evolutionary process that's going to turn a dinosaur into a bird, for example, you're going to need to have some new functionality go on. And my point behind the information, and I think what Dembski and Meyer are both getting into, is if you're going to have a dinosaur which doesn't have wings, nor does it have any of the other adaptations to produce a bird, then you've got to have at some point this new function come. For example, dinosaur reptile lungs and bird lungs are completely different. And like what my friend was saying about the eye, at no point during the eye's development does it bear benefit to the creature until it's complete. So this idea that it benefits you and therefore extends the lifespan or the functionality of the creature, it really doesn't come true. Because until that product is completely functional, like the wing on a dinosaur, if this thing slowly happens like you guys are talking about, then you would find these examples of it, which of course you don't find any, of this unfunctional wing hanging off the side of this creature. And in the evolutionary idea that this is supposed to help the creature better function in its environment, well, I'm sorry, but it doesn't. It's got this unfunctional wing that's doing nothing but getting in his way for foraging for food. And my point is that first of all, in experiment, you don't see it. They radiated the fruit flies, and the fruit flies never produced anything except for what's already there.
You're repeating because we've already. Yeah, right.
So that's my answer to it. That it's the reason why they bring it up is because the information has to be there to describe a wing, and in a bear or a dinosaur, it's just not. I'm talking about the dinosaurs that are bipedal.
Yes, and we're gonna go ahead and in just a brief minute, I'm gonna have everybody give your last little final thoughts on this, and we're gonna take a 10-minute break. But let's go ahead and finish up with some final thoughts, and we'll just kind of bounce back and forth as well. Anybody want to?
Okay. So I want to just go back to basically what I've said many times, which is that the ultimate arbiter of scientific truth is experimental evidence. You can muse as much as you'd like philosophically, and I don't mean that to disparage philosophers. There are many philosophers who do good work, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to go into a lab, you have to be able to go into nature and see what you're talking about. Scientists, again, come from all sorts of walks of life. Every religious background is represented. I've had professors from who are Catholic, who come from various evangelical backgrounds, who come from who are Muslim and other faiths. We don't set out to prove something true. We look for the truth. And it's maybe a high ideal, maybe we fall short sometimes, but that's what, as a community, that's what we value and that's what we're after.
Okay. Michael?
Okay. Yeah. In final words, I would just assert that there's.
Sorry, actually, not just final. I mean, we're going to be taking a break and then do a Q&A after. Final thoughts on just this portion
in the panel discussion.
Yes. Before we get to the Q&A, sorry,
Yeah.
I was misleading.
Okay. I would just assert that there's not really a conflict, I think, between faith and reason or between science and religion. And I believe that a lot of the concepts that we've discussed today, I believe that there can be a creator and there can be, the formation of life on Earth, however we find that it did, or however we're testing. And I would find it a fundamental good or even godly pursuit to be investigating the nature of reality and coming to these conclusions and learning more. And I'd find that a fundamentally good thing, even from a religious perspective.
Awesome. Kelly, did you want to have one more little quick thing, or do you find with before?
I've been blabbing enough.
There we go. No worries. Go ahead.
I think what it comes really down to is being comfortable with the idea that life can come from non-life, rather than just dismissing it. We know so much more these days. On the science side, we don't know how life started yet. There are many arenas of possibility. There is the RNA world idea. There is metabolism first. There is amino acids forming on pools in the earth, at the bottom of the ocean, within the crust, outside in the emptiness of space. And all of these, of course, have their challenges, so those should all be examined, and that's the scientific method, ruling out the problems with them. I don't really think it's proper to think of life as going from non-life to life as like a switch that came on. I think it's most probable that it would be more of like an evolutionary process where you've got something that starts with a set of amino acids and then becomes a little bigger, a little more complex, a little more stable in its environment, whatever triggers, a certain energy or excess with other, eventually you get the formation of cell walls by the polarity of the molecule, I forget what it was, that captures it. You get enzymatic reactions that involve to get together just because they're near each other. There's a million steps, and at some point, you're never going to say that that one became alive. You're going to say that this one over here was a bowl of inorganic chemicals, and this one here, a million steps later, has metabolism, has waste products. You know, we don't know what the first cell is. We don't know what the first protocell is. We don't even know what the definition of a protocell would be. But it seems to me that all you have to do is intuit be comfortable with not knowing, and you know, there's going to be research on this for generations and generations.
Definitely.